Hi, this is Cody with our organs, and we are continuing our reading of Deleuze's seminar, What is Grounding? Continuing from Free, Ground, and Question. We had just finished reading a debate from Deleuze's, the debate between Kant and Hume. One that happens in texts rather than in person, and by text I mean books rather than digitally, how most arguments are had today, I would believe. Deleuze brings us up to score with the movements from Hume's empirical realism, the questions and problems that he posits in the essay on human understanding. He then takes us through the critiques of Kant on the notion of transcendentalism, where the transcendental logic leaves us. And now we are left between this movement that he believes happens between Kant and Heidegger in recognizing the idea of what is grounding. This question now will be with us for the entirety of this reading. The ground is a third. The establishment of this fact takes another figure. In what does the grounded thing change its state? This third neither boils down to the grounder nor to the beginning. What is it? What surprise does that which is grounded bring us? Here we might ask what the motive of philosophy is. For some it is wonder, for others it is anxiety. We have seen that which appeared anew through mythologically. It is a cosmic dimension. Repetition, eternal return, a theme dear to Nietzsche. Result: whoever appeals to a ground makes a demand. He poses as if being provided with a right. The claimed thing is the ground, and this opposes the human being to the animal. The human being finds reason within the form of the enunciation of a right. We have distinguished three senses of ground with Kant and Heidegger. 1. The ground is to render the submission of the one to the other necessary. The ground is truly a third term, the third. 2. The ground is the assignment of a domain or of a territory. 3. The demand has conditions of validity that limit the domain. Here we have retrieved the two same problems, but on a philosophical plane. The equivocal. The ground and the one who appeals to it. What does the principle that grounds teach the grounder? Is it that this principle pre-exists? It is an answer that he learns? The relation between the two terms, the grounder and the new figure of the ground, must be in the idea of grounding itself. Is that which the ground reveals, far from being an answer, not a question instead? The Sphinx formulates a question. Whoever appeals to the ground receives a question about the ground. The mythological equivalent is the oracle, the prediction. The ground tells us what it is about. This presupposes that we do not know in what the question consisted before appealing to the ground. Now, the relation of ground and grounder is especially complex, as the ground does not present an answer but a question. Therefore, it is by confronting the ground that one is grounder, one disposes of the question. We should discover the new figure which the grounded itself assumes. But what is this question? We always believe that it is solutions which must be determined. The activity of interrogating receives its determination for us from what it eliminates. Now, because of that, it is suggested to us that the question has a structure in itself. What is the question which reunites ground, grounder, and change of the grounded? Particular style among philosophers. These are questions specific to philosophers which render one speechless. After some effort, Heidegger arrives at a question which risks deceiving us. He arrives at why is there being instead of nothingness in the introduction to metaphysics. And what he keeps repeating is that he wants to suggest that we cannot wait for an answer of the empirical type to empirical interrogations. Perhaps at the philosophical level the answer is contained in the question. Leibniz, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there this rather than that? Henceforth, everything is reversed. The ground teaches us a question, and only the question can elucidate the problem. What are the possible hypotheses? For whatever philosophical question, we can make three hypotheses. 1. Maybe this is deliberately a question without answer. Its purpose would be to silence the answers. Philosophers of the paradox, by Kierkegaard, by Shestov, It is strange that he died around 1930 because Chestov did not know Kierkegaard until very late in his life, and the resemblance between their philosophies, even in their way of expressing themselves, is an amazing case of coincidence. He has written in the tone of commentary, an extraordinary tone. He departs from Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. His thesis on Shakespeare is impossible to find. They also call these philosophers of the scandal, of provocation. Thinking is also thinking against reason. The decomposition or betrayal starts with Socrates. As we shall see, the two authors diverge at the end. For Chestov, what remains is the human being and his questions. Absurd. For Kierkegaard, what remains at the end is faith. Abraham's son is restored to him, but in the domain of the absurd. 2. The question is such that, in a certain way, contains the rule of all possible answers within itself. It tells us the principles to be used in the solution of all problems. Leibniz thinks that a method must be universal. It is the universal characteristic of which the principle would be discovered in the structure of all problems. 4 principles: identity, sufficient reason, indiscernibility, and continuity. 3. The question gives us a rule to distinguish true problems from false ones, and this is what we must expect from what grounds. It is Kant's direction. For him, the problems posed by Leibniz are a typical illusion. Why this instead of that, etc. Bergson is an author who is quite Kantian in this sense, an irrational vision of the ground. First hypothesis: the ground is linked to the ground. Obscurity of this notion is appealing to what grounds not being ready to go up to the absurd. Second hypothesis: the ground is rationally known. Is this not the idea of sufficient reason as Leibniz says, the idea of the radical origin of things? The third hypothesis: the ground would have a critical conception. Is there not also this aspect to the ground, distinction between validity and non-validity? Historically, a great philosopher who has handled these questions is Socrates. There is an essential relation between ground and question. 3.1 Socrates and the question. Socrates proceeds by question and answer. But as his answer, Socrates says, it has nothing to do with me. He says, I am the question, or love, or the philosopher. What is in question is the dialectic. It starts with Parmenides, with Zeno. We find it again in Socrates and Plato, in the Stoics and Aristotle. We find it in Kant, Hegel, and Marx. They all appeal to the dialectic differently. Etymologically, conversation and distribution. How do these two notions organize themselves in the dialectic? What is distributed in the conversation in order for it to be a dialectic? Questions and answers are distributed. Great difficulty of Socratism. Socrates was against a state of affairs which he deemed characteristic of the Athenian society. Everybody in politics talks perpetually and without knowing anything. Democracy, anyone can say his piece. He rebels against that. Socrates' questions in the small dialogues consist in circling around the interlocutor and stranding him in contradiction, up to the point where he has just one thing left: his anger. Socrates leads the other into contradiction. At first sight, the dialectic consists in a distribution of questions and answers according to characters. But it is never Socrates asking the questions. They tell him, you are an electric ray. See this in Meno. It is about something else. The two persons annihilate each other. The interlocutor is annihilated in the sense that he falls into contradiction. He is dead on the level of logos. Socrates himself says, it has nothing to do with me, again in Meno 80c. He seems to be removing himself. Whence the symbolic importance of Socrates' death. This is also a death in the logos. At first sight concerns a distribution. At a second glance, it is a double annihilation. It is necessary to first of all force people to shut up. First aspect of the question. Chestov found this very well, because according to him, we have to stay there and push these questions, which are my answers, as far away as possible, because the essential point is to silence the answers. What is Socrates against? Against the doxa, against opinion. The state of the doxa? It has an essential theme. On the one hand, on the other hand. It affirms partial truth and affirms them as follows. Where they of course touch upon one's own genius, upon one's own truth. What it poses as absolute is a partial truth. The on the one hand, on the other hand. It is the worst enemy of opinion. Doxa turns things into parts. Beautiful text by Marx in The Poverty of Philosophy. He says that Proudhon's philosophy is a petit bourgeois philosophy because he believes the dialectic is on the one hand, on the other hand. A thought which remains in this stage, says Marx, is a thought of petty bourgeois opinion, doxa. Opinion allocates its great themes at this level. The structure of opinion rests on a structure of appropriation. Philosophy has it in for this situation. Good sense is the target of philosophy. It denounces good sense's pretension of being philosophy. Good sense divides truth into parts. There is a diabolical arrogance to one who divides and yet usurps, because these are only partial truths. Descartes' phrase, good sense is the best distributed thing in the world, has a deliberately comical side from this Descartes' discourse on method. By its essence, good sense distributes, divides. There is an internal mystification in this text. It suffices to look at the context. Nobody says I am stupid. Descartes says, let's take that literally. It is quite riveting but very dangerous, a funny path of philosophy. Descartes says that there are imbeciles de facto, but never de jure. The problem of stupidity is relegated to individual psychology. This interpretation is very serious and questionable. He has eliminated stupidity from the theoretical problem of thought, which will be reduced to the false and the true. So the essential rule of good sense is division, confirmation, in the difference between Fichte's and Schelling's system of philosophy. Hegel writes amazing pages on the opposition between good sense and philosophy. Hegel says that on the level of good sense, of doxa, the absolute is nothing more than sentiment, and that truth dwindles into simple partial truths. But good sense presents this as ground of the truth by presenting it in the absolute. Now, Hegel wants to go beyond this stage, and Marx as well with regards to Proudhon. The absolute cannot be the object of a sentiment. Truth cannot be partial truth. It is Hegel's concept, and this is referring to the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, aka the truth is the whole, both subject and substance. The secret of Socratic irony. The dialogue proceeds by division. He thinks that each partial truth proceeds through contradictory truth. Socrates has taken just enough doxa to contradict it. The partial truth opposes itself to another partial truth and falls into contradiction. It seems a good organization of dialogue, but in reality it is the termination of dialogue, though from the inside. Doxa is left with only one solution, anger. Doxa feels the sentiment of its absolute waver. All opinion is conformist, it is non-paradoxical. Paradox seeks to find a domain where divisions contradict themselves. The ancients and Socrates were also fond of paradoxes. The ancients also see the modern paradox of vicious savages on the idea of the arts. Math is there to resolve them. The rule of the island. One is told, say a sentence, if it is true you will be hanged, if it is false you will be shot. Then one day a stranger says, I will be shot, and then we can no longer shoot him. The logicians have applied themselves to the problem of the paradox. Cantor has elaborated the theory of mathematical sets. He found a bizarre paradox. Any set which does not contain itself is an element called normal. We do not arrive at a total interiority. Call E the set of all normal sets, instant logical contradiction, paradox. Essential constitution of an element such that it constrains and forces the set of which it is part to contradict itself, that is to say, contradict itself as element. I lie is nonsense, because it is nothing other than the determination of something filled with misleading propositions. The point of view of Pascal has to be analysed from a purely logical and even formal perspective. His famous bet, Pascal's wager, can be found in section 233 of the Pensis. The bet does not concern God himself, but the existence of the human being for whom God exists, and that of the human being for whom God does not. Pascal says that if the latter knew he had to bet, then he would not have chosen his mode of existence. From a formal perspective, the theme of the choice assures two logically contradictory determinations. There we have a veritable aggression against good sense. The paradox demonstrates contradictory characteristics of partial truths in themselves. The paradox presents me an element which is impossible to allocate in the sense of which it is a part within the set, because it already entails the set in comprehending itself as an element. The question comes back to Socrates. Good sense and philosophies are enemies, bullfighting. Socrates is dead because of it. Anytus is the representative of the Athenian middle class, one of the prosecutors of Socrates. He represents the ideology of the middle classes, which is an appeal to fair representation. In the myth of Protagoras, Plato does not take a sophist into consideration. The myth of that is that of division. Technique equals unequal division, political consciousness equals equal division. There was language, logos, in the division. But good sense says philosophy, this is nothing. But what is the origin of philosophy? A problem? Why is philosophy not a part of all civilizations? Philosophy is essentially something Greek, and it cannot be found in other cultures, regardless of which culture. The countries that have established philosophy, first Greece, then it became French, English and German since the 19th century up to our own time. The French Revolution was not fought up in France but in Germany. How to explain that Spain, Italy, even though we can name philosophers from these countries, have not produced foundational philosophical currents? Hypothesis? Perhaps because philosophy finds its origin in the very existence of its enemy, in the middle class. Rome? Big problem. Early disappearance of the middle classes. True for Spain, false for Italy. At the level of Socrates, it is definitely true. Socratism is constituted in opposition to doxa. For Isocrates, doxa is the only philosophy, an ancient Greek rhetorician. Proceeding from a thought, proceeding by division. If philosophy is born in Greece, it is because Greece forms a negative condition for its existence. Conclusion regarding Socrates' method itself. It seems to install rules which turn language into a serious thing. That which produces doubt is Socratic irony. In effect, there is no Socratic dialogue. He borrows the dialogue in order to annihilate it. He wants the dialogue to terminate itself. There is a seduction to dialogue. That is what Socratic irony is. With every question he poses, he eliminates a partial truth. And at the end, there is death by contradiction, represented by one who contradicts. Other idea from Socrates? What happens during this destruction? Socrates knows it has nothing to do with him. He does not believe in the dialogue. What does that signify positively? Well, the sophists hated long speeches because these were the speeches of certain persons. It is not speech itself which Socrates refuses, but he wants that speeches no longer be that of persons. He wants that the science of speeches comes from an identity of speech and the thing. It is the idea. He wants the logos to be the expression of the real as such. The relation is no longer between souls, but between the soul and the idea. This is what Socrates calls reminiscence. It is that the idea presents itself as already there. The way in which the soul establishes contact with the idea is always for the second time. The forgotten is nevertheless fundamental. It is metapsychological. The forgotten has become the fundamental relation between the soul and the idea. How can the forgotten, a negative term, have this role? The incarnated soul finds itself before exterior objects which tell it something. It is thus in the sensible world that we have encounters which awaken the recollection of the idea in us. The fundamentally forgotten expresses itself in the encounters we have in the world. The forgotten poses itself as being already there, whence the whole theme of anterior existence. It is thereby that Socrates has a mathematical problem solved by a slave in Plato's Meno 82b. Thus the question had to be such that it concerned a veritable ground, likely to serve out rules for the solution of problems. It is because the question rises to the idea that it enters into relation with principles serving for the solution of problems. How do sensible things participate in the idea? In Plato's philosophy, the most profound thing is knowing how the ideas exist among themselves. It concerns thinking the relation of the intelligible, and this will be the most profound object of dialectic. The proper question concerns rules permitting the constitution of the rules themselves. End of 3.1. 3.2. The question that silences. Kierkegaard and Chestov. And 3.2.1. The most lyrical and the most simple. Kierkegaard and Chestov have an ambivalent attitude towards Socrates. They hate him, and yet they are obsessed with him. They oppose Socrates to Job. What interests them in Socrates is the first aspect of the Socratic question, the irony. See Kierkegaard's concept of irony. On the concept of irony with continual reference to Socrates, which was his university thesis. Socrates nevertheless distorts the question which silences by going beyond it. For them, Job is the private thinker. He knew how not to betray. Socrates turned himself into a public professor. Job is the one who asked for explanations which he demanded would be first-hand. Now, doxa by nature contents itself with a second-hand answer. But for Kierkegaard and Chestov, reason contents itself with a second-hand answer. Reason demands that we submit ourselves, that we recognize the law. The problem of thought will be posed in a singular fashion. Reason calls the crime of the spirit the crime of the law, or the mind. But Shestov says that reason has never called the death of Socrates scandalous here and now. Socrates' treason is that he settled for demanding second-hand explanations. Job will stick to his question and will not content himself with a second-hand answer. Job takes God aside. He demands a first-hand answer. Perhaps such an answer does not exist elsewhere. This refusal of reason is important because we find it again in the philosophers called irrationalists. They privilege other powers than thought, but most profoundly, they think we can think against reason. But why do that? Because reason always invites us to obey, to submit ourselves to generality. So Kierkegaard has a secret in his life which suffocates him, the thorn he has in his flesh. The exact nature of this is a matter of debate. The following passage from the journals and papers seems to support Deleuze's familiar interpretation. At an early age, a man is bound to a suffering which is a thorn in the flesh to him, places him outside of the universally human, and thus hinders him from being able to enjoy life, and forces him into a God relationship as the only consolation and salvation. Kierkegaard's relation with his father. It only ever happened to Kierkegaard as a story, but it is a considerable one. His engagement, am I able to get married? The engagement-marriage problem only makes sense on the level of ethics. Kafka's problem was analogous. His and Kierkegaard's fiancée Regine was a veritable philosophical concept. See The Seducer's Diary. My wife is a little sister to me whom I love a lot, with whom I live. From Kierkegaard's Either Or. He investigates the meaning of marriage. There is a veritable qualitative leap from engagement to marriage. What does this idea of a broken engagement signify? It is the singular event. Shestov has given a philosophy of tragedy, which refers to Dostoevsky and Nietzsche's The Philosophy of Tragedy, of the absurd. Also see The Myth of Sisyphus by Camus. He appeals to Dostoevsky, who had made the first critique of reason, not Kant. If God does not exist, everything is permitted, from the brothers Karamazov. It's a lot of books, the brothers Karamazov. Russian, sorry, little bit here. Russian authors, specifically of the time of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, were paid by quantity. So the more they wrote, the more they got paid. So that's why their texts tend to be quite epic in size. It is in Dostoevsky's and in Nietzsche's will to power. It signifies that ordering is necessary, and they invoke the Nietzschean theme beyond good and evil. And Shestov adds beyond true and false to it. The Pascalian theme of the bet is certainly in this line: ethics must replace morality. Oh, Nietzsche in The Genealogy of Morals in the third essay says something quite close, which is nothing is true, all is permitted. 3.2.2 Morality, Duty, Law, and Power. Morality always makes us think about duty and law, but it also announces to us that duty comes first, what we call deontology. The ground of duty is in our supposed perfection insofar as we are supposedly reasonable beings. The problem becomes, what must we do? But a whole group of cursed authors exists. They ask, what can we do? Then, duty does not come first. Their concern is following through on what we can. If it is not true that duty and law come first, then all power must be realized. The origin is legal. A reversal appears around the 16th century, one which risks going unnoticed today. It is the theory of the state of nature and the civil state in Hobbes, a veteran of paradoxes. He had a classical theory in which we confused it with that against which it rose up, the ancient theory of natural law which expressed our nature of being reasonable. Hobbes begins by demanding explanations. He believes that the natural law has meaning if we relate it to the real and concrete order of motives and passions of the human being. Then, power and right are primary and unconditional. Then in Hobbes there will be the idea that the law must limit power. It still remains primary. Now we will find this legal theme again in all the authors who criticize the law. The problem of ethics is that of power. That was already the theme of Callicles in the Gorgias. He agrees to break the law which separates me from what I can do. Ethics always faces the law. If Spinoza calls his book Ethics, this is why. The law which would defend is a mystification to him. The moral law is ultimately nothing but a badly understood natural law. Duty is an illusory form to him. Despite his rationalism, he keeps telling us that human beings only differ in that which they can do. Virtue is the realization of one's own capacities. A crime is virtuous if it expresses a veritable power. Spinoza is ultimately a rationalist, because he will focus on demonstrating that crime is a diminution of power. So for all of them it comes down to calling for a realization of one's proper essence. With Kierkegaard, this philosophy will be able to call itself a veritable philosophy of the absurd. For him there is an answer on a certain plane, irrational, when the human being has gone all the way to the end. Spinoza's letter to Wilhelm von Bleinberg, these letters were very, very influential for Deleuze's Spinoza and Practical Philosophy. A quick quote from the footnote: "Therefore the command given to Adam consisted solely in this, that God revealed to Adam that eating of that tree brought about death, in the same way that he reveals to us through our natural understanding that poison is deadly, in the idea of an ethics as opposed to moral law." This comes up specifically, this very same note about God's ethics, Spinoza's ethics, as opposed to morality, comes up in Spinoza and Practical Philosophy by Deleuze. It is already what we can call an existential philosophy. For them there are two ways of existing, and the notion of choice is understood as follows. There are those who exist in an inauthentic way, those who submit themselves, who do not know what the question is, and there are those who exist authentically, who know that the question is to go all the way to the end of what one can. Thus the question of morality concerns something else than the one who questions, whereas the question of ethics concerns nothing but the one who questions. This theme of going all the way to the end will define thought. It must also go all the way to the end itself. And think what? The unthinkable, says Kierkegaard. This thought reconciles itself with life. Kierkegaard demands, "Give me a body then." It is likely here that Deleuze here reads Kierkegaard through Camus. Kierkegaard himself shows us the path taken. It is the leitmotif of the journal. What I lacked was the animal which also belongs to human destiny, but give me a body then, from the myth of Sisyphus. The relations of thought with life, claim of a unity. Now it is a life which must submit itself to thought and Socratism. It is reasonable philosophical life. On the contrary, in Kierkegaard, life cannot deny itself, cannot submit itself to the order of reason. The paradox expresses a divorce of life and thought. Thenceforth it is thought which submits itself to the categories of life. For this it boils down to thinking the unthinkable. See the philosophical fragments. Do not think ill of the paradox, this passion of thought, and the thinkers who lack it are like lovers without passion, which is to say lousy partners. But the climax of all passion is always to want its own loss, and it is equally the supreme passion of the intellect to seek the shock, although this shock is in some way or another leads to its own ruin. This is the supreme paradox of thought, to want to discover something that it cannot think itself. In this book, Kierkegaard opposes his method to the Socratic method, and see in the Meno where learning is remembering. Socrates wonders how this question is possible. For him, the activity of questioning implies knowing and not knowing, so the ground of the question lies precisely in remembrance and reminiscence. What does that signify for Kierkegaard? Well, 1, for Plato, all research is research into memory. Truth does not come into the soul from the outside. One who does not know instead only has to take recourse to remembering in order to become conscious of what one knows. 2, when truth is as if internal, inside, then from that moment on, Master Socrates is but an opportunity for the disciple to recollect, the obstetrician. 3, forgotten knowledge was always already there, so an instant has no consistency whatsoever by itself. The temporal starting point does not matter. The instant falls into the inessential. To this, Kierkegaard will oppose that which according to him is the true contribution of Christianity. For him, the master is not the occasion, it is Christ. Then the moment is something essential. This refers to the issue of the historicity of Christ and of the first man. With the Greeks there is no such thing, the position of a secular time. Henceforth the disciple can never recover the truth in himself. It is necessary that the disciple in himself be a truth. From Kierkegaard, from the Philosophical Fragments, from the Socratic point of view, the moment is not to be seen or to be distinguished. It does not exist, has not been, and will not come. Therefore the learner himself is the truth, and the moment of occasion is merely a jest. Henceforth the master presents himself in the condition to understand the truth. The non-truth of the disciple signifies not just that he is outside of the truth, but against the truth signified by Christ the Redeemer. The disciple has lost a condition because of his own fault. At this level, the essential concept is that of the sin. The master is no longer an opportunity. The instant becomes decisive. Kierkegaard can say, all the pathos of Greek thought focuses on memory. All the pathos on our thought focuses on the instant. From the Philosophical Fragments. But what does the instant signify? It is one and the same as his first theme, the unthinkable. Christianity is the paradox. The instant is one and the same as what purely exists. This existence only arises as soon as your back is turned. What is the absolutely different? Sometimes Kierkegaard says it is the pure existed. What purely exists, sometimes it is the instant, sometimes sin, the fundamental category of faith. In the end, it is repetition. What does he have in common with all this? In his battle against rationalism, Kierkegaard attacks the themes of the rationalist tradition. There were two strangely mixed themes in this tradition, one concerning the relation between essence and existence, the other concerning quality and quantity. End. 3.2.3 Existence and essence, quality and quantity. The first. The ontological proof seems to define the rationalist position regarding existence. It seems it comes in all kinds of shapes, appearing first with Saint Anselm. He wants to prove the existence of God. That is to say, existence. He takes a phrase from the Old Testament literally. The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. See Psalm 14:1. Now whoever says God does not exist contradicts himself. To do it, you have to define God without postulating his existence. Saint Anselm says that God is the being such that nothing greater can be thought. Now, in supposing that such a being does not exist, we are in a flat-out contradiction, because we can think a greater being, only this time existing. So I cannot think the idea of God without the object of this idea positing itself as existing. Therefore, within ontological thought, existence is deduced from essence. His essence envelops existence. There is a paradox, because God is evidently the only case of being like that. The idea of the table poses possible existence, but not the real thing. God is the only case, because he is infinite. So, existence is a perfection. See Descartes' appendix to the fifth set of objections and replies. Kant replies to this, and Deleuze is going to bring this up, the idea that existence is not a predicate. What seems strange is that the prima facie evidence is only valid if we consent to treat existence as a property. Yeah, there we go. Can we treat existence as a perfection, that is to say, as ultimately an attribute? Not at first glance. Existence is the position in the being of the subject of judgment. Existence is positional and not attributive. Since the Middle Ages, two critiques were developed against the ontological proof. For some, God exists necessarily, but if he is possible. For others, God exists necessarily, but if he exists. The one will lead to Leibniz, the other to Kant. The meditations are accompanied by objections. In the fifth one, Descartes develops the ontological proof, and we see the two objections. The one leading to Kant, the The proof concludes the existence of God from his possibility. It treats existence as a property. Now, existence is irreducible to a property, yet we do not know that the thing already exists. It is in the third part of the critique of pure reason that Kant will take this critique up anew. 2. The one which leads to Leibniz seems very different. It consists in saying that we can conclude existence from possibility on the condition that God be possible. It is not because I form an idea in my mind that this idea is possible, which breaks with Descartes' distinction between idea and possibility. Moreover, Leibniz thinks that is feasible and reproaches Descartes only for not having done it, but he himself does it. But do the objections get to the heart of what the supporters of the ontological proof had said? Did they treat existence as a property? First of all, they insisted that this was only valid for God. Moreover, it was not a deduction, but an intuition in which we see an existence in the essence. It is absurd to define existentialism as a doctrine in which the existent is irreducible to the essence, because that was already said before them. Proponents of the ontological proof have really not ignored this irreducibility. The ontological proof was the typical example of rationalist and mathematical physics. Descartes made a veritable critique of properties by replacing them with the idea of quantity and relation. Sorry, it's pronounced Descartes. The S is silent, some French stuff. The difference between two bodies is merely one of extension, of movement and position. The other differences are never anything but in function of life. Everything is a difference of movement. Existence, essence equals a metaphysical theme, but quantity and quality equals a physical theme. Kierkegaard will treat these themes as being one and the same, but at the same time he will call upon the rights of what exists and of quality. The existence of God, he says, appears when we let go of the proof, when we turn our back. It is quite like quantity and quality, says Kierkegaard. The problem is why at some point a quantitative continuity transforms itself into a new quality. A quantity of temperature decreases in continuous manner, the water becomes ice, but the ice appears all of a sudden as a new quality. The qualitative continuity all of a sudden entails a new quality. Why at that moment rather than another? For Kierkegaard, what exists is quality. It is the leap, the qualitative jump. The one cannot engender the other. This is an important theme, because in physics there is an interesting occurrence concerning supersaturation and all transformations. By active processes we go beyond the normal moment of the apparition of a quality without having it appear. Then, thanks to special bodies, a new quality is made to appear. The two themes in Kierkegaard mingle because in a certain way, in the same manner, that existence appears behind the back of consciousness and that quality arises suddenly and not progressively. Kierkegaard is not original there. With him, the right of what exists, the right of quality, the instant, the qualitative jump, what exists and the quality are one and the same as the instant. And this is the great error of scientism. Final point. Kierkegaard tells us something similar regarding sin. There he is much more original. These three first themes are taken up again in the veritable philosophy of sin. He opposes a Christian philosophy to a Greek philosophy. It is to oppose Abraham and Job to Socrates. He thinks that sin cannot be engendered from sinfulness, sinning as a property of human nature. We conclude the nothingness of sin from an imperfection of human essence. Thus the rationalist conception of evil is like the counterproof of the rationalist concept of essences. Kierkegaard's theme will be, we can never conclude sin from sinfulness. It also implies a qualitative leap. Sin is the brute apparition of a new quality. Sin must then be thought and related to anxiety, which is the relation of consciousness with the absolutely different. Whence the concept of anxiety, which is a category of thought that he would like to see replace the old notion of the perfection of human nature. Thought treats its object as the same. The Greek philosophy, there is a unity to the intellect. To give a new task to thought from there, that was new, hence thought is in the paradox. We approach the definition then of existentialism, irreducibility of essence and existence, and the primacy of existence over essence. Is that correct? Perhaps still for that of Sartre, but in Kierkegaard it is in fact very different. Kierkegaard calls this psychological investigations of sinful consciousness, and see this in the introduction to the concept of anxiety by Kierkegaard. Shestov calls this torrid and glacial waves. Existence does not favour a theme. They want to make human existence the new object of thought. Thought must now know that which is essentially other than itself. And the greatest confusion would be to treat this other as starting from the same. Anxiety is the right concept for thought and for psychology. Insofar it is a psychological state, anxiety is completely stretched into something irreducible to psychology. Also send the psychologist back to another domain than that of the psychologist. Anxiety is the psychological state which corresponds to sin, which becomes an existential dimension. Anxiety is psychological consciousness directed to an object which is irreducible to it. Anxiety is thought insofar as it apprehends its own irreducible difference with its object. Next is 3.2.4 repetition, which I will begin reading next time. The end of this will mark the end of this recording and of this reading. But just before I go, I'm just going to quickly bring up something, since we're also on the same time reading Seminar 1 by Jacques Lacan. There is something that has just been mentioned here towards the end of this section on the question of grounding in terms of the law, and here we have been taken through existentialism in response to this idea of law, to rationalist essence versus empiricist existence, to a debate between Kierkegaardian Christian philosophy and Greek philosophy in comparison to Socrates. There has been this theme of absolute difference and repetition to that which anxiety gives itself proper, and this will be taken much further in this next bit on repetition, and this will become, in 20 years' time, Deleuze will finally write difference and repetition. But here, Deleuze is making the same, and I believe the influence comes from Lacan, is making the same inference as Lacan about anxiety, which is a very important concept too for Lacanian psychoanalysis, which is also a response to psychology. Lacanian psychoanalysis is very critical of what was called ego psychology, but also to other dominant schools of psychoanalysis of the time. He comes up with the idea of the real, which is usually seen in a dialectic or a triad between the symbolic and the imaginary, which are three different registers of experience, three different constitutions of subjectivity. Anxiety is that which never lies. It has to do with one's proximity to the objet A, another Lacanian concept, and it is that which is attached to the real. Anxiety is the emotion which never lies, simply because it is the revealing of the subject to that which is beyond them, to that which is... Anxiety is thought insofar as it apprehends its own irreducible difference with its object. It is both absolute difference and, as Deleuze said earlier, repetition. Both absolute difference and pure repetition. This is what Lacan will then govern over the next course of his seminars, and will develop much, much later on in the seminars, the idea of the real, that which is unsymbolizable, that which resists symbolization for the subject, that which we could only really call pure difference. And also at the same time, Lacan says that it is that which always returns to the same place. And this will be an ongoing philosophical psychoanalytic debate between Guattari, Lacan and Deleuze, whose Anti-Oedipus, which will come out in the 70s, 20 years after this, will directly respond to these notions which come out of Lacan. The psychoanalysis, the concepts of the subject, of desire, of anxiety, and specifically of the Lacanian real. So it may be helpful to quickly watch perhaps Plastic Pills video on the real, or to read a little bit of Zizek's How to Read Lacan before getting into this next bit of What is Grounding by Deleuze, which will bring up these notions that we find in Kierkegaard and Christianity and in the Hegelian logic that Zizek has helped us with very much today as a contemporary philosopher, with these Hegelian notions that come from Koheve and Hippolyte, which deeply influenced the thought of Lacan, which deeply influenced the thinkers of his time and after him. Which include the Kohevians and very much Deleuze. Deleuze's teacher was Hippolyte, who was there since the first seminar of Lacan, since the very first decree. So, thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed, and I hope you're there next time to check out the next section of Deleuze's What is Grounding. Thank you very much.